Recently, I put a tweet up on Twitter that got more traction than just about anything that I've put up. And here's what I wrote. Why is it that no one seems to bat an eye when a parent feeds their kids unhealthy garbage fast food, but the minute they say, I'm raising my children on a healthy, whole food, plant-based diet, people scream child abuse? Really? Have you checked the stats on disease and obesity for kids? I could not believe the number of responses I got to that one tweet. I got hundreds of likes, I got comments, I got retweets. And what it made me realize was there's a huge interest in people learning how to raise their kids as plant-based eaters. So on this episode, I've invited a doctor from Vancouver, British Columbia, who's going to share how he actually works with parents on helping their children to transition to a healthy plant-based diet. As a vegan himself, he has a commitment to doing all he can to raise healthy children in the world today. So stick around, you're in for quite a treat.
Are you ready to live the life you deserve? Do you want to feel vibrantly healthy and reach your optimal weight without dieting while being kind to animals and the planet? Then you're in the right place at the right time. Welcome to Plant-Based Eating for Health with your host, certified plant-based nutritionist, Kathleen Gage.
So, Dr. Nagra, I am really excited to hear what you have to say about children and plant-based eating because I know there's a lot of controversy over it. I actually have talked to a few parents who said people were going to call social services on them and just outrageous stuff. And you can look at the statistics of what's happening with children around obesity, adult diseases. And what is your experience with children and the way they're eating and why plant-based eating would be a good idea?
Well, first off, thanks for having me on. As far as working with parents in my practice on how to raise or how to properly feed their children as they're raising them, especially if they are adopting a plant-based diet, a lot of them come to me because they haven't gotten that support elsewhere. They've been told by potentially their, pediatrician or friends or family that, oh, you're going to be missing out on X, Y, Z. You're going to be, putting your child at risk for inadequate growth and so on. And so, there are things that we need to focus on if you're feeding your kid a strictly plant-based diet for sure, but it can absolutely be done healthfully. And that's where that education component comes in, right? I just want to make sure that they're doing it in a healthy way and kind of giving them that peace of mind that, you're doing what you need to be doing. And the research shows that it can be done healthfully if you're taking these steps.
Well, when is too young to start a child on plant-based eating? Because I actually talked to one woman who from birth was raising her baby with no dairy, no meat products, and which is very unusual. And she's one of the ones that people threatened to call social services on, and yet her baby was developing great, was very healthy. So when is too young?
I wouldn't say that there is a too young. So we actually have research on women who are vegan through pregnancy. And then, we have data on kids, say 1 to 3 years old, 6 to 18 years old. These are a couple studies that the last two I mentioned there out of Germany in the last few years. We also have a study back in the 80s. Now, this is going way, way back called the Farm Study. So this was a community in Tennessee that they called the Farm. And they were actually lower socioeconomic status than vegans tend to be nowadays. Nowadays veganism tends to be a little bit more favored in higher socioeconomic circles. But back then they were lower socioeconomic status than the general population, but they were very informed on how to properly formulate their plant-based diet. So they actually fortified their own soy milk. So they would have their soy milks and they would add vitamin D and certain B vitamins to it. And we had parents right through birth or right through pregnancy into birth. And then, you had children growing up to be, say, 10 or so years old, completely plant-based, healthy, adequate growth. So it can absolutely be done.
Well, let's flip the narrative a little bit on, we're talking about healthy kids being raised as vegans. What about kids that are being raised on meat and dairy, that the obesity rate, what is the obesity rate among children now?
I'm actually not sure what the exact statistic would be right now, but it is increasing. That much we do know. However, I wouldn't say that that's necessarily something that is only in amongst omnivorous kids, right? Only amongst meat eating kids, right? That's something that can happen with, say, vegans, vegetarians as well, but they tend to be at lower risk. In fact, a lot of people you may hear online are more concerned about, say, vegan children being underweight or not growing fast enough. And we can talk about that data a bit too. But one of the things that really sticks out to me from the research that we have is, yes, we do see that omnivorous kids are more likely to be in the overweight or obese category, but even their cardiovascular risk factors or other cardiovascular risk factors like LDL cholesterol, for example, tend to be much, much higher than the vegans. And while it may not be a problem in those first couple decades of life, because it's not going to build up to the point where you're going to, say, have a heart attack, but you keep that up through the entire life, you're looking at potentially heart attacks, 40s, 50s, 60s, and onwards. And so trying to instill healthier eating habits early on, especially amongst those meat eating kids, I think is really important as well.
So what would be a healthy way to raise a vegan plant-based child? Because people can be vegan and still eat a lot of junk food. There's, that whole discussion that goes on in Facebook groups, and people are like, well, I eat Oreos and I eat potato chips, and that's great. But we're talking about healthy eating. So what would a parent need to look out for, or parents need to look out for, as far as starting their children on a healthy plant-based diet? What kind of supplements do they need? What kind of, additions to their diet do they need to assure that they're going to be healthy?
Yeah, well, first off, I would suggest, because everyone is going to be a little bit different in how they tend to eat at home, and you want your kids to kind of, adopt similar eating patterns, hopefully, to what you're eating as a healthy adult. So working with even, say, a dietitian or someone in the area would be a really good place to start. But that aside, there are some just basic things that we should be taking care of. For one, calorie density is huge. As I mentioned, there are concerns that some will raise about vegan kids being malnourished and not achieving adequate growth in that. But if we look at the research on that, it's very easily explained by just not eating enough calories. That's almost always the case. And that could be because they're eating a really low fat diet or a raw food diet, or just loading up on the fruits and veggies, but not having all that much of the grains and legumes and nuts and seeds that have that higher calorie density. So focusing on foods that are more dense, like I said, those legumes, whole grains, and so on, is going to go a long, long way. And actually including some liquid plant oils, so like olive oil, vegetable oils, that kind of thing, can also help bump up the caloric density. So that is a big one. The other thing is vitamin B12. Of course, need a B12 supplement. That is non-negotiable, in my opinion. We actually have research on, again, that research out of Germany I was mentioning, where if you look at those who weren't supplementing, a huge proportion of the vegans were in the deficient end. If you remove supplementation and fortification, even more. But if you look at the vegans who are supplementing, I mean, their levels are even higher than the meat eaters most of the time, right? So you want to make sure that you're supplementing B12. Vitamin D is also an important consideration depending on where you are, especially. So like here, I'm in Vancouver, we don't get sun year round, and we don't get very strong sun year round, that's for sure. So a vitamin D supplement can be really important. Another nutrient of concern that tends to come up is iodine, but this isn't exclusive to vegans. I want to go back to the vitamin D as well. That's not necessarily exclusive to vegans, but it is a nutrient that should be focused on anyway. And the primary source of iodine in the diet is going to be iodized salt. So we see a lot of people now adopting, Himalayan salt into their, culinary practices, and that's typically not iodized. And so you could be losing out on the iodine there. Another source of iodine is actually dairy, but it's not because dairy inherently contains iodine. Do you know where it comes from? I'm just curious.
Have no idea.
So they clean the udders with iodine of the cows, and then it ends up in the milk.
I'll be darned.
Yeah, so that's where it comes from. So yeah, dairy is a source of iodine, but it's essentially like taking a supplement, right? So a supplement might be a decent idea too if iodized salt isn't being incorporated regularly. So again, another nutrient that you want to be considerate of. And calcium is possibly a concerning one, especially if they aren't really consuming fortified plant milks. So you want to ideally fortified soy milk. In fact, that's the only one that's actually recommended for children, according to the American Academy of Pediatrics and the Canadian Pediatric Society. And that's because its macronutrient ratio is just overall better. It's closer to human milk. It's just better for overall growth. And it's the most nutritious when it comes to micronutrients as well. So
I'm curious on the salt. Would liquid aminos be a good substitute, or is that not good?
As far as I'm aware, it's not fortified with iodine.
Okay.
So I would say probably not. That's actually something I should look into. But usually it's just iodized salt, or you can get low sodium alternatives that are potassium based that are also containing iodine. But there are cases where that might not be ideal, like in say severe renal failure, kidney failure, or something like that. But typically that's not really something that is going to be concerning for children in particular. But again, these are all things that should be discussed with the healthcare provider for sure.
Now, do you work primarily with children, or do you work with people of all ages?
All ages. I just tend to see a lot of parents who are raising their vegan kids. So actually, I've got some coming up today. So yeah.
Excellent. Well, and I'm curious, let's say a parent has been raising their kid on the standard American diet, which happens to be McDonald's and Wendy's and Burger King and all that. That is now the standard American diet. And they realize that maybe they have reached a point they need to make some changes. Their child might be getting sluggish, not turning into a couch potato, spending all their time on social media. What would be some ways that a parent, first of all, could reach you? And I want to remind people that you're listening to the Plant-Based Eating for Health podcast show. I'm your host, Kathleen Gage, and I'm talking with Dr. Matthew Nagra. And you're based out of, is it British Columbia or?
Yeah, Vancouver, BC.
Vancouver, BC. Okay. So how would people, first of all, get in touch with you?
Yeah. So you can follow me on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, all the social medias. Check out my website as well, drmatthewnagra.com, where I do post some longer form content than you'll see on social media, as well as linking all the podcasts. So this will be up there too. And then if you're in BC and you wanted to actually work with me, whether that's in person or via video, you can absolutely do that. Again, all the booking information is on the website as well, or you can send me a message on social media and I'll probably be able to get back to you. Although once in a while, a message does slip through the cracks.
Absolutely. We can't count 100% on email. So how would a parent transition their child? Because I know more and more people, I think that's the one good thing that happened as a result of all the shutdowns and COVID is people did more research. And so being vegan and being a plant-based eater has risen to the top more than ever before. And let's say a parent is ready. What do they do? Be sure to leave a rating and review of the show. And if you're looking for more visibility, be sure to download my free guide on how to increase your influence. It's called The Influencer's Guide. Simply go to veganvisibility.com/influencer. That's veganvisibility.com/influencer. Now, back to the show.
Well, again, obviously working with someone would be the best here, because I think one of the really important factors to answering that question is what is the baseline, right? Now, you mentioned standard American fare, a lot of fast foods, that kind of thing. A simple swap in what sorts of fast foods you're eating could go a long way. For example, if you're going out to McDonald's for a quick bite, why not go to Chipotle and get a whole wheat burrito with beans, rice, salsa, and avocado? Right, that is a huge step up. So I usually look at what someone is already eating and where we can make those simple changes. So another one would be if someone's using white rice all the time, switch it for brown or switch it for quinoa. Really simple swap. Might take a little bit longer to cook, but ultimately not a lot of additional steps there. And one of the most impactful things that someone can do, at least in my opinion, is to swap out animal protein sources for plant protein sources. So it's starting to learn how to prepare those plant protein sources like your tofu, tempeh, seitan, if you want something maybe a little more meaty, or occasional use of the plant-based meat alternatives as well wouldn't be a terrible idea.
Wonderful. Well, actually, you just gave me some blessing here because I actually just prepared my tofu that's going to go into my Thai meal tonight. And I've
Nice.
been, I'm coming up on 4 years of being 100% vegan. And initially, I didn't call myself vegan. I didn't want to be a vegan. I didn't want to identify as such. And I was a plant-based eater. I was 64 at the time, dealing with what a lot of 64-year-olds deal with, inflammation. And I started resigning myself to the fact that's the way it was until I did my research, and I decided for 7 days I was going to give up meat and dairy and see if anything changed. Not only did I get rid of the inflammation in 2 days, I dropped 5 pounds. I was about 40 pounds heavier than I am now. And my entire life changed. 6 months into it is when I really identified as a vegan, because I describe it as kind of a spiritual awakening of what was happening to the animals. And now we're going to completely flip the narrative into senior citizens, because I can't believe I call myself that, but I am. Turned 68 in May, and I'm just a couple of years from 70. I was looking at longevity, and the average age that women pass on is 78. So I've got like 10 years, but I know it's going to be longer. But what can senior citizens do that maybe they haven't been eating the healthiest and they want to start eating plant-based? Is it ever too late?
So no, it's not too late. We know that for a lot of these diseases, especially cardiovascular disease, it's a cumulative, sort of development of that disease. If we look at, say, LDL cholesterol levels, typically, bad cholesterol as it's called, LDL are actually the particles that carry the cholesterol, but we don't need to get too much into that right now. But basically, what determines your risk of having a cardiovascular event is how much of those LDL particles your blood has been exposed to, or your bloodstream has been exposed to, over your entire life, right? So it just keeps compounding on top of itself. And so, your risk might be going like this, but you could bring it like that, for the rest of the trajectory. And that's sort of how we look at a lot of these diseases. It's never too late. We know that it's not too late. So as far as things to do, well, are you moving your body and all of that really important? Actually, resistance training is huge. That's something that isn't done enough for bone health, for maintaining muscle mass as we age. But for diet, I actually think one of the biggest things that really doesn't get enough attention from especially the plant-based community is protein intake. So we see that as you age, your ability to digest and utilize protein declines. And we actually have a meta-analysis from 2020 looking at all the studies on, or the majority of the studies on, protein intake and total mortality. So that's risk of dying throughout a given period. And we see that higher total protein intake, but specifically higher plant protein intake, is associated with a lower risk of death. And so actually bumping that protein intake up a little bit from what is typically consumed or typically recommended is probably a really good thing, especially as we age.
Wonderful. Good to know. Well, it's interesting because pre-pandemic, I was weight training a lot. I actually, in my 30s, was going to compete in bodybuilding, had a trainer who wanted to put me on steroids, and it's like, no. And so we kind of went our separate ways. But I always believed in the natural way with bodybuilding. But then about 15 months ago, I actually broke my wrist, and it was a freak accident. It wasn't anything to do with brittle bones. As a matter of fact, the surgeon said I had some of the best bones he's seen. And when I went in for my physical therapy, it was shocking to see people what they resign themselves to, the knee surgeries, the hip surgeries, and a lot of it was to do with their diet. So I actually need to get back into weight training, but I'm having a little bit of trouble with my wrist. I don't know what I'll be able to do, but it's like we can use that as a limitation, or we can say, okay, how do I work around it? So again, how do people get in touch with you, Dr. Nagra?
Yeah, so on Instagram at Dr. Matthew Nagra, same thing, Twitter, Facebook, all the social medias. And on my website, drmatthewnagra.com, I do have an email box. So you can just send a message in there and I'll get it to my email.
Now, you mentioned, and thank you for that, and we'll make sure to put all that in the show notes. You mentioned again that you do remote counseling with patients. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I started doing that during the pandemic. We weren't given a lot of other choices, especially around, I think it was March of 2020, everything shut down, clinic was closed. And so I took about a month off, and then I started offering the online appointments.
Wonderful.
One thing though to note is that just because I'm only registered in BC, I'm only seeing patients in BC. I haven't gone through the process of registering elsewhere. I know I've gotten some requests from like Ontario and that. So at least for individuals who are in BC, more than happy to work with you. And if you're outside BC, you can certainly message me, and I might actually know somebody in your area, right? That is something that I do quite often if I do happen to know. And if I don't, I can possibly point you in the right direction to some resources to find someone.
And that actually brings up another thought where with a lot of people, they have talked to their doctors about going plant-based, and they've had doctors who have said, oh, no, that's not a good idea. You have to have meat and dairy. I was very fortunate to have a doctor who, although she's not vegan, she fully supported my decision because she saw my numbers get better. She saw me dropping weight. At one point, she had said, you need to get your weight under control, because if you don't, you're going to have a stroke, you're going to have a heart attack, you're not a kid anymore. And those are reality checks that we go through. But what would you say to somebody who has a doctor that doesn't support them giving up meat and dairy? Should they educate their doctor, or should they find another doctor? What's your recommendation?
Well, that really depends on your relationship with them, and of course, the ability to find another doctor. I mean, here in Vancouver, it's impossible right now to find a family doc. So, a part of it, I think, is just advocating for yourself. If they're trying to recommend something that is, counters your morals, then you could just say like, sorry, I'm not comfortable doing that, and they should respect that. I don't see why they wouldn't, and actually. On that note, there was a study that just came out of France looking at beliefs and attitudes of both general practitioners and pediatricians, and they found that about half of them would advise their patients against consuming a vegan diet, and somewhere like 80, or I think it was 83% of them thought that a vegan diet was a risk factor for protein deficiency and stuff like that. So while super, super important. I certainly go to the doctors. Everyone should. When it comes to nutrition, I don't know that we should expect them to be the expert on the topic, because they just don't learn that much about it, right? Anyone who does actually took additional training for the most part. And in that same analysis from France, they found that the doctors, the few of them who also had nutrition degrees, they tended to be a lot more favorable towards it, which was really interesting to see. So it is just really a lack of education there, which is why I advocate for looking for a nutrition professional. Yeah, some doctors may be really well versed in that area, but if not, request maybe a referral to a dietitian or something too, to discuss the dietary approaches.
Wonderful.
Right? It should be a team effort. Healthcare doesn't need to be one person. Right? It can certainly be a team effort.
Well, and I probably should have asked this question early on. How did you get involved in plant-based nutrition and the whole realm of veganism?
Yeah, so when I was younger, through my childhood, early teens, I struggled with weight management. I had asthma. My fitness level was never where I really wanted it to be, even though I played a lot of sports. And it wasn't until a personal trainer of mine back when I was about 14, 15, actually wanted me to record my food intake for a period of 2 weeks. And my diet was really bad, really, really bad. So I didn't want him to see that. I wanted him to think I was eating a lot healthier. So what I did was, for those couple of weeks, I didn't lie on the sheet. I actually changed my diet. I actually full on. So I got rid of dairy. I cut out a lot of pretty much all of the classic sort of junk foods, ultra processed foods. I increased my fruit and veg intake. I decreased my meat intake. Started feeling better. Weight started coming off. I was breathing easier. Skin was clearing up. It was really cool to see, right? And that's what initially sparked my interest in, okay, well, what can diet do for me? What can nutrition do for me? And over the couple of years that followed, I just really learned more and more. And eventually, when I got to university in my second semester, I went all in 100%. And then the ethics actually came afterwards. That's where I sort of got more exposed to things like the Earthlings documentary and so on.
Well, and that's kind of what happened to me, but that's hysterical. I love it. It's so you didn't want him to know that you ate a really bad diet. I love that. That's great. That's great. And, it's really amazing because I have some friends who are professional bodybuilders and they're 100% vegan, plant-based, and they take first all the time. And, I think when we're educating people, we have to meet them where they're at. If somebody's interested in fitness, show them the movie Game Changers. If they're interested in the environment, show them one of the environmental movies. If they're interested in the animals, then show them Dominion, whatever they're interested in, meet them where they're at. So, Doctor, in closing, what are your final thoughts for people?
We have quite a bit of evidence now that vegan diets can be suitable for all stages of the life cycle, just like the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics stated in their position statement, which was written by Vasanto Molina, who's a dietitian here in Vancouver, actually, fun fact. We just don't have data suggesting there's anything inherent to a vegan diet that makes it non-suitable for, say, children, right? Whenever there are issues like inadequate growth amongst a child or any sort of a nutrient deficiency, it's explainable. We can see, okay, they're under eating or whatever, and we can fix that, right? There are things that we can do to, better consumption of fortified foods, supplementation, etc. So it's just about educating yourself, working with someone who knows the topic really well, and there's a bit of a learning curve to it. So if you are feeling, say, unsupported in what you're doing or how you're raising your kids or how you're eating yourself, I think seek out help from someone who is just really informed on the matter.
Wonderful. And I'm glad you said there's a learning curve, because I think sometimes long-term vegans get very impatient with newer vegans. And, like if somebody says, I'm on that vegan diet, and there's vegans who jump all over them, it's not a diet. And it's like, whatever it takes to get people to move in the right direction. So I really appreciate your time, and thank you so much for coming on the show. I know that a lot of people are going to be listening to this, either watching it or listening via Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Really appreciate what you're doing. I encourage everybody, go check out Dr. Nagra's website at Dr. Matthew Nagra. Did I get that right?
Nailed it.
Okay. Have a great day, and I wish everybody a lot of health.
Thank you for your commitment to an ethical life through plant-based food choices. The kind of choices that are kind to your body, the environment, and most of all, animals. Be sure to leave a review and rating of the Plant-Based Eating for Health podcast show.